And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Indigenous peoples.
Dear co-chairs, member states, major groups, and other stakeholders, I present on behalf of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group and Tebtebba, an Indigenous Peoples Global Policy Research, Education, and Resource Center. I would like to congratulate you on your work and efforts to bring together various stakeholders in order to identify best solutions and synchronize efforts with other processes, such as SDGs, Post-2015 Development Agenda, and UNFCCC. Indigenous peoples represent over 370 million people and occupy 20% of global land. We're the guardians of Mother Earth, but we, like no other group, are vulnerable to the changing climate conditions and prone to impacts of disasters. From the sea ice in the Arctic to the coasts of the Philippines, Indigenous peoples oftentimes find themselves in the front lines and carry the burden of the world's contribution to climate change and associated disasters. We strongly urge to link disaster risk reduction to SDGs, and specifically to poverty eradication. Poverty and marginalization multiplies impacts of disasters on Indigenous peoples. As you all know, recent studies show that in low-income countries, while the economic loss is relatively low, the loss of human lives is very high. Given the fact that the majority of Indigenous peoples are concentrated in low-income countries, and the fact that Indigenous peoples constitute 15% of the most poor, while being only 5% of the world's population, these numbers show disproportionate pressure on Indigenous peoples in terms of impacts of natural and human-induced disasters. Following the process on SDGs, we are very glad to see the inclusion of the target 1.5 under poverty eradication. By 2030, build the resilience of the poor and those in vulnerable situations to disasters, shocks, and climate-related extreme events. And we hope that this target remains in the subsequent version of the Zero Draft. We're glad to see the inclusion of civil society and other stakeholders in the process, and it is important to hear many perspectives and voices to find the best solutions. We urge you to recognize that Indigenous peoples are the key stakeholders and must be fully and effectively involved in the process of mitigation and adaptation to climate change and disaster risk reduction with a rights-based approach. Indigenous peoples should be considered as not just beneficiaries, but active participants in the design and strategies for adaptation and disaster risk reduction. However, we keep facing the problems of full and effective participation in decision-making, including the United Nations, Arctic Council, and other global and national meetings. I would like to emphasize the importance of inclusivity and consultations with Indigenous peoples in all stages of the development and formulation of targets, indicators, and national policies for the DRR. And we wish to reiterate our call to include the right to free, prior, and informed consent in all the climate change and disaster risk reduction processes and decisions, in accordance with international obligation and instruments such as the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and ILO Convention 169. We would like to stress the importance of informal discussions between PrepComs and the multi-stakeholder approach to the process, and ask for inclusion of Indigenous peoples in these discussions. Further, I would like to bring your attention to climate-related disasters, which are exacerbated by the century's gold rush for fossil fuels, oil and gas exploration, construction of development projects such as hydro dams and infrastructure, all leading to the increased risk and vulnerability of Indigenous peoples. Some of the critics say that there is no direct correlation between industrial development and disasters. However, there is a vast field of knowledge and data gathered in the past decade proving that industrial activity is significantly contributing to the intensity and scope of natural disasters and a major cause for the majority of human-induced disasters. In cases of large hydro dams, for example, scientists found that they cause changes in the river hydrologies and temperature, which in their turn change the temperature and flow in the oceans with the consequences of formations of unusually powerful and devastating typhoons and hurricanes, such as the one happened in the Philippines in November 2013 that devastated indigenous peoples. With this, we would like to raise concerns over the fact that both SDGs and disaster risk reduction processes seek, as one of the solutions to implementation, partnerships with the private sector, the same sector that is responsible for much of the contribution to the human-caused disasters. We understand that not all private sector entities are the same, but we urge the public sector does not delegate the responsibility, and that the private sector illustrates responsible leadership and extends hand for partnership based on basic human rights principles. We're not against the private sector per se. We're asking for appropriate safeguard systems and participation in decision-making and consultation in regards to DRR program financing and implementation. We would like to point out further on, we would like to point out the role of traditional knowledge systems in developing strategies for disaster risk reduction. Indigenous peoples around the world have used their traditional knowledge to prepare for, cope, and survive disasters. Their methods and practices have originated within their communities and have been maintained and passed down over generations. Until recently, policymakers have largely ignored this vast body of knowledge in favor of Western science and technology-based methods of disaster risk reduction and response. We need to promote effective sharing of information, knowledge, and research, and combine local, traditional, and Western science perspectives. As indigenous knowledge comes from an intimate relation with the nature, communities have learned to read the signs in the sea, in the ocean, in the rain, in the wind, clouds, vegetation, and wildlife to predict hazards. These local, experiential, early signing systems are frequently credited with saving lives and property. There is a need now to engage world leaders of indigenous peoples interested in risk reduction, together with their non-indigenous counterparts, in an ongoing dialogue aimed at understanding risks, those that are unique to indigenous peoples and those shared in common with vulnerable communities throughout the world. Therefore, we urge that the outcome document for the World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction includes effective approaches to reduce risk to disasters through engaging IP leaders and their communities in appropriate studies, documentation of indigenous knowledge and practices for disaster risk reduction, inclusion of traditional knowledge and coping mechanisms in national, regional, and local disaster preparedness and post-disaster plans with the goal of reducing their vulnerability and increasing their resilience into these events. Finally, we're asking for inclusion of targets and indicators on preparedness and prevention for those who are most impacted by loss and damage, including indigenous peoples. Unfortunately, the occurrence of hazards cannot be avoided, but with proper measures, impacts of disasters can be significantly reduced. Therefore, preparedness and prevention are crucial. For indigenous communities who live in locations of high probability of disasters, these targets translate into provision of financial and material support in preparing for disasters such as hauling materials, stocks of food, camp beds, medicine, gas, emergency power generators, and etc. It is important to note that it is responsibility of national governments, specifically on the municipal and local level. Therefore, these targets should be well formulated in national plans worldwide with indigenous peoples' participation and consent. Thank you, chairs.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for his statement.